Hello to everyone in Canton, New York and beyond. I'm Bill Hilton Jr. in York, South Carolina. I regret I can't join you, but wanted to share a few words with you on this bittersweet day of remembrance for Dr. Jim Shuman. Thanks for allowing me to send my own thoughts via video chat. I've heard people describe folks they've known for 25 years as lifelong friends, but Jim Shuman and I went a lot further back than a mere quarter century. 58 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, and a couple of days to be exact, all the way to mid-June 1964. My guess is that among all you assembled today, I knew Jim for more years than anyone, except maybe his brother Lee. I met Jim in June '64 when I was a South Carolina delegate to the National Youth Science Camp in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, where the rhododendrons grow. Jim had been a 1963 Iowa delegate and was elected alumni president for his year, guaranteeing him a spot on staff in '64. He ran the sports program that summer, one of many roles he ended up playing at future camps. I remember Jim for his musical talents and good humor, and we hit it off immediately. In subsequent summers, we worked together on staff and our friendship deepened, so much so that he came several times to visit my wife Susan and me in South Carolina. Jim and I communicated often, and he introduced me to his passion of watching birds. Or should I say, he infected me with an interest I couldn't shake. In 1975, Jim's dad, Rule, an avid birder himself, invited Jim, Susan, me, and several of my high school students to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary for the fall migration of raptors, furthering our incurable passion for birds. 2 years later, in 1977, Billy III was born to Susan and me, so we asked Jim to drive from Morgantown to our Newberry College alma mater. There he served as godfather for Billy's baptismal service, tightening another link in our relationship. Soon thereafter, I carted the family Hilton off to the University of Minnesota for grad work in ornithology. I studied blue jays for 4 very long, very cold, very dark winters, while Jim worked on his own advanced degrees in environmental education at West Virginia University. We corresponded regularly, and in early 1979, Jim brought Siobhan and recently hatched Corey to Minnesota to meet the Hiltons. A few years later, they had Ryan, who I met on subsequent visits to see Jim. Jim and I eventually finished our degrees, and a lot transpired during the following decades. I went back to teaching high school biology in South Carolina, and Jim taught at a variety of colleges until finally ending up as chair of the education department at St. Lawrence University. Among other things that transpired, Susan and I bought an old farmhouse on 11 acres here in York that I incorporated as the nonprofit Hilton Pond Center for Piedmont Natural History, with a mission of furthering environmental education, natural history research, and conservation. Jim Shuman was delighted by this endeavor, in part because bird banding and hummingbird research were in the mix, and he agreed to serve as founding president of the center's board of trustees, a position he held until his passing. In this role, he advised and counseled, helped with fundraising, and acted as a self-appointed editor-in-chief of This Week at Hilton Pond, an award-winning series of photo essays I still write for the center's website at www.hiltonpond.org. Based remotely at Hilton Pond, I also became Director of Program Research for the National Youth Science Foundation, while Jim served first as Science Camp Director and then as board member for the foundation. It was during those years our relationship intensified and broadened immensely, as we collaborated on everything from innovative science education programs to designing facilities for grant writing. Jim and I met regularly in New York, West Virginia, South Carolina, and several times in Washington, D.C., where we sometimes dropped in for unscheduled but productive meetings with high-ranking government officials, reporting our results to Foundation Board President Ron Pearson. We were on the phone almost daily, bouncing around our latest ideas and often chatting about birds we'd seen in our respective locales. Jim and I employed different styles. I joked we were the grease, him, and the hammer, me, but we were complementary, almost never argued, and thoroughly enjoyed working together. Some years after he and Siobhan parted, Jim met his soulmate in Laurie by Solina, who became his wife in a 1996 ceremony involving students at a Gouverneur, New York elementary school where she was principal. I flew up from South Carolina to shoot the official video, its soundtrack punctuated by shouts and cheers from hundreds of little kids in the school cafeteria. Laurie had promised her students an in-school wedding if they met reading goals for the year, and Jim enthusiastically endorsed the plan. Jim and Laurie eventually bought a lovely little cottage with boathouse on the St. Lawrence River near Morristown, New York. So Captain Jim, an avid fisherman, bought a motorboat and took great pride in showing the waterway to visitors like us Hiltons. We liked cruising up and down the seaway, especially when ending up across the river for an international breakfast at Brockville, Ontario. In years following, I visited the Shumans in Morristown, once with Susan. Always enjoyed good company and long, convoluted stories. As you may have known, Jim and I prided ourselves on being weavers of intricate tales. Shumans and Hiltons alike appreciated that the Morristown College faced west, allowing us to watch the sun setting over Brockville across the river. Jim taking to heart and often repeating my personal maxim of never trust a person too lazy to get up for sunrise or too busy to watch the sunset. Susan and I were likewise eager for Jim to come see us at Hilton Pond, sometimes with Laurie, and to walk the nature trails I wrote about in This Week at Hilton Pond. One trip Jim made from New York to South Carolina was to reconnect with his godson, Billy III. When he graduated from high school in 1995, Billy tightened the Hilton-Shuman connection by following in the footsteps of his father and his godfather by being selected as a delegate to the National Youth Science Camp. As such, he was the first son of a science camper since the program began in 1963, and likewise was undoubtedly the first godson of a science camper. As logical progression, Jim's visit in 2008 was primarily to officiate the wedding of Billy and his fiancée Amanda Hurt in Hickory, North Carolina. Among other accomplishments through the years, Jim and wife Laurie had attended seminary and gotten ordained as interfaith ministers. So Jim was glad to help Billy and Amanda tie the knot 31 years after he stood as sponsor at Billy's baptism. As much as we Hiltons enjoyed hosting Jim in South Carolina, perhaps my most fulfilling experience with him came when he signed up as a citizen scientist on one of my neotropical research expeditions, part of Operation Ruby Throat, the Hummingbird Project. In chayote fields around Ujaraz, Costa Rica, Jim got to observe me for 9 days in my dual roles of researcher and teacher, and even to hold and release neotropical hummingbirds. There was nothing the two of us enjoyed more than learning new things and passing that knowledge to others. So I was deeply satisfied to share with Jim Shuman in Costa Rica. We were incurable, insatiable educator naturalists, and Costa Rica was nature education heaven. Back up north, cold weather along New York's St. Lawrence River got icebound every winter. Eventually got to Laurie and Jim. So in 2017, after both retired, they moved to be with friends at On Top of the World adult community near Ocala, Florida. Jim immediately got involved with local astronomy and birding clubs, writing newspaper articles, and leading field trips for both. He and his spouse enjoyed warm weather existence on Top of the World, dining out and playing cards and going to the fitness center. But in a sad twist, Laurie became ill with non-alcoholic liver disease and passed away in November 2019 in hospice at home in Ocala. Jim and her 3 adult Helena children, John, Dan, and Betsy, were at her bedside. Jim was devastated by the loss of his wife of 23 years, so I made a trip south to Florida shortly thereafter to be with him. We reminisced about Laurie, of course, but to soothe his soul, we spent a lot of time birding, first at Shalom Park on Top of the World, and then at Sweetwater Wetlands Park in nearby Gainesville, a beautifully implemented artificial wetland that is home to an amazing array of wildlife and native birds that Jim appreciated. Jim and I communicated even more frequently post-Laurie, especially since the stress of bereavement seemed to worsen his back problems. Within 6 months, he required reconstructive spinal surgery and a residential rehab. Susan and I drove to Ocala in July 2020 to pick him up on discharge and brought him back to Hilton Pond for a few days of rest before he flew on to Decorah, Iowa. There, elder son Corey, and partner Kyra were waiting to take him in and help him get better. For the next year, Jim was part in Iowa, looking at Decorah's famous bald eagles, and part-time in Ocala, watching burrowing owls, steadfastly trying to get better at walking. In October 2021, Jim stopped at Hilton Pond during a southbound snowbird migration down from Iowa. Susan and I made plans to meet with him at his Ocala home on New Year's Day 2022, which we did. As was his custom, Jim greeted and honored us with our South Carolina state flag. During that visit, Jim and I demonstrated we were still up with the times, designing a new fully virtual summer science program for high school juniors capable of being implemented with minimal environmental impact. Jim went back to Iowa in spring 2022 and spent much of the years flying around the country. He was in West Virginia and Washington, D.C. on behalf of the National Youth Science Foundation, and then in Philadelphia, Boston, Colorado, and Arizona, visiting with members of his melded but widespread family. Lest you forget, Jim had an unusual and vibrant sense of humor, and he reported he was particularly excited. He, Corey, and Kara had stopped one day at the Spam Museum in Austin, Minnesota. In recognition of that auspicious occasion, Jim sent Susan and me a Spam dishcloth, a Spam refrigerator magnet, a Spam postcard, a Spam car decal, and most important, a Spam meat slicer to make sure our Spam slices henceforth were just the right thickness. Yummy. On Labor Day last year, Jim flew on to Nantucket, staying a bit with his brother Lee and wife Kathy. Jim mentioned plans to return to Iowa from there and then drive south to Hilton Pond for my mid-September birthday celebration before heading to Florida for the winter. But then Jim Shuman's well-orchestrated 2022 travel itinerary just fell apart. While on a short flight from Nantucket to Boston on 10 September, a kidney stone dropped and lodged in Jim's ureter, causing intense pain that led son Ryan to escort him to the emergency room on landing. Despite his discomfort, Jim opted a few days later to continue on to Decorah for treatment by his regular urologist affiliated with Mayo Clinic. Although Jim sent me a funny text message on 20 September to show he was still in good humor, complications developed and painkillers and high-dose antibiotics were prescribed. Jim was admitted sequentially to hospitals in Wisconsin and Iowa, with the kidney stone eventually removed via laser lithotripsy, but discomfort came and went and came again. He improved a bit, did physical therapy, and was set for discharge on 17 October, a long 5 weeks after the kidney stone appeared. Tragically, Jim did not make it home after his organs apparently failed on the 16th due to overwork and systemic infection. That afternoon, I was stunned to get Corey's phone call with the unbearable news his dad had passed away peacefully that morning. During the weeks after that call from Corey, I found myself thinking of Jim several times a day, wondering why there wasn't some telepathic way I could send him a message about my latest natural history adventure. I doubt that initial urge to communicate will end anytime soon. Nonetheless, I'm pleased that 2 days before passing, Jim felt strong and lucid enough to proofread the late September installment of This Week at Hilton Pond. I smiled out loud when he told me by phone he was tickled and touched I had quoted him in that particular photo essay, referencing his lyrical interpretation of the song of the black-throated green warbler. He said, "Zo-zee, zo-zo-zee." And I'm especially grateful Jim and I had the chance for one more lengthy phone conversation on 15 October, the day before he died. I always knew when he was calling since his ringtone for me was the turkey gobbling, but that's one of our countless funny stories for some other time. I believe Jim's brother Lee may have originated the turkey tale. After relating all the above, it looks like I've now woven a significant part of the Hilton Shuman story for you, and I hope you can see why he meant so much to me. I'm glad for having known Jim Shuman during nearly 60 years. I'm glad for what he meant to me, to Susan, Billy III, and second son Gary, and to Hilton Pond Center. I'm likewise glad to have met many of Jim's family members, and I'm glad he and I shared countless friends from science camp and diverse places. What a joy for Susan and me to have spent so much quality time with him during his final 2 years. Here at Hilton Pond Center, we established a Jim Shuman Memorial Fund, part of which has gone to plant a grove of hybrid American chestnut saplings, one of Jim's favorite trees. These provide a permanent reminder of him whenever we lead field trips along the wooded trails. In the months before he died, I told Jim Shuman how much I appreciated our relationship and that I consider him my lifelong best friend. With his usual thoughtfulness, he responded with, Bill, I think of you not as my best friend, but as my closest friend. How much better a description was that, because it summarized the depth and breadth of our affection for each other and our understanding of each other. Indeed, Jim Shuman and I were each other's closest friend, mates in the Australian sense of the word, and his loss leaves a gaping, unfillable hole in my heart and mind. I missed Jim last summer. I missed him today. I'll miss him tomorrow and daily thereafter. I'll miss him every time I think of something I want to tell him to make him laugh or ponder, or when I want to convey that we were and always will be lifelong closest friends. We knew without saying we loved each other in ways only such friends can understand. So rest in peace, Jim Shuman. You were one of a kind, and the people you taught and the good you did make you immortal. I just hope you and Laurie are waking up together every morning where the rhododendrons grow.